Good morning, everyone. This is the fifth episode of IFTF's online collaboration series. And this one is the Great Communications Hackathon. I'm your host and fellow student, Mark Frauenfelder. I'm an editorial director and research director here at IFTF. Today, we're honored to be in conversation with Toshi Hu. He's a director at Institute for the Future's Emerging Media Lab, and he's leading it in research that dives into the continually evolving relationship between humans and the sophisticated media systems we create. He's also a musician, documentarian, an XR producer, and just an all-around wonderful person. I always love talking to Toshi whenever I have a chance. How you doing, Toshi?
Very well. Right back at you, Mark. I've
Good.
been looking forward to this for a while. So
Yeah, uh, I'm always loving having Zoom meetings with you because you come up with like amazing backgrounds and filters where you turn yourself into a turtle or an alien or something.
that could happen today. I won't. You never know what's going to pop up. Things can happen.
Excellent. Yeah, hopefully we will get a taste of what you have to offer there. So let's just jump right in here. Wait, what do we have going on? Do you have an identical twin that you've never told me
Well,
about?
we have been doing some work in the lab around virtual twins and virtual beings. Sometimes they escape the lab and you can't really control them. But yep, yep, oh,
Get that guy out of there.
doing the show. Okay. Yep.
That's awesome. Um,
Let's go
yeah,
back to the lab, though.
that's a perfect example. That's great. Yeah. So let's jump in. Tell me a little bit about Emerging Media Lab. This is something that we've been doing now. I don't know, going 3-4 years now.
Yeah, so I joined IFTF in 2016, and we started the Emerging Media Lab then. And as folks probably know, there are a number of labs at IFTF. We're looking at everything from the future of governance, future of health, future of food, and the Emerging Media Lab is really looking at the future of communications, collaboration, and human connection. And we take a really wide kind of definition on the term media. It's not just, the things that we typically think of as media. It's really any sort of tool that we use as humans to connect or collaborate or communicate. And we're similar to other labs in that we do, more traditional IFTF foresight work where we do reports and forecasts. But we also get to do some interesting prototyping projects as well. So we've developed some, we often go out and try to find experiences that, because a lot of the work that we're looking at is experiential media. So this is like virtual reality, augmented reality, things like virtual beings. And a lot of times it's hard to just talk about these things, right? You need to experience them.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an experience lab. You can see it behind me here in virtual
Mm-hmm.
form, where we often, bring people in to let them experience these technologies and this kind of new kind of storytelling and content. And then, so we curate really interesting examples from amazing designers and developers from around the world, but we also sometimes realize something doesn't exist yet. So we like to find ways to prototype those things. So we've created a immersive data visualization VR experience, which is a multi-user experience. So it's a collaborative world you can go into and explore network or organizational data. We've created something called Simtainer, which I know you're familiar with, and that is basically IFTF's immersive storytelling platform to allow people to step into the futures that we're imagining. So we get to, provide people with experiential features, both in the form of just the technologies and content, as well as doing storytelling about futures that we're developing in other labs and other projects.
Yeah. Can you do any other of the R&D projects that you've worked on come to mind that you could talk about in a little more detail?
Sure. One of the projects that we did initially in the lab when we started in 2016 was to, I give a keynote talk about the future of embodied computing. And it can be hard to just talk about embodied computing because it's, like I said, experiential, it's embodied.
Mm-hmm.
But, at least at that point, and still today, we couldn't like put everybody in a 2,000 person audience in a VR headset. So we wanted to
Mm-hmm.
show a way, provide a way to give people some sort of view into that world. So we worked with a composer, Daniel Berkman, based in San Francisco, who's done a lot of work with me on immersive media projects, to create a virtual reality music performance piece. So Daniel goes into a VR headset with me on stage and performs this piece as an embodied composition where he's moving around the stage. And that really helps people to see a couple things. Number one, as we like to say at See for the Future, that all artists are natural futurists, because, and that's not just because they help us imagine what the future could be, but they also ground it in kind of human meaning and human experience. So a lot of times when people think about virtual reality, the early signals and examples of that are mostly like gaming or tech demos. So we wanted to show that this is going to be a new way that we're going to not only express ourselves and explore new types of worlds, but do this with our entire body.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting with that project is we actually performed that a couple times, and then we worked with one of our partners, Cisco's HR Innovation Lab. They saw that performance, which looked a lot like a network visualizer, and they said, well, can you take that and turn that into a visualization tool for us to explore our organizations in new ways, more as emergent teams, as kind of network connections between individuals. And so those kind of projects were connected in that way.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Just back up a bit. What do you mean by embodied computing?
Right. Sorry. Sometimes we just drop
Oh,
these
that's
terms
okay.
at IFTF. Yeah. So right now, we've spent the last kind of 50 years kind of integrating computing into our lives, in all aspects of our
Mm-hmm.
lives. And, in many ways, we've developed, our literacies, and we've built our world around these kinds of computers. Now, the computers that we experience now, the ones we're talking through right now, these are kind of the paradigm is a flat screen. It's contained windows. It's really like a limited portion of my experience here. And I'm primarily interacting with it with my eyes and my voice, a little bit my hands, but it's really much more of kind of a conceptual, cerebral experience. When you get into something like virtual reality, where you're putting on a VR headset and you're going into a virtual world, and you have hand controllers, here I actually have some right here, and you're going in, and sometimes you're even tracking your whole body. Now your whole body becomes part of that interface. And one of the things we try to do often at IFTF is help people reframe what they're seeing now into how they might see it and experience it in the future. And often, again, a lot of people have seen VR as a game experience or a tech demo. And what we're trying to say is VR and augmented reality, kind of similar to AR, these are just computing interfaces. These are ways we're going to interact with our computers. Just like right now, I use a screen and a keyboard and a mouse. We're going to be interacting with our bodies in these embodied interfaces. And aside from being, much more dynamic and representing much more holistically ourselves, these kind of bring in whole other interesting kind of questions around things like embodied cognition, which is this idea that we don't just think with our brains, we actually think with our bodies. And we don't just think with our bodies, we actually think with each other with our bodies, and we also think with our environment. It's a much more relational kind of understanding of what cognition is. So VR and virtual reality and augmented reality represent these kind of new classes. Sometimes people call them spatialized computing interfaces, because we're using space and we're using our bodies, that are going to open up kind of new channels of communication, expression, and even just thinking, because we're going to be thinking with our bodies.
Have you been watching the Amazon TV series called Upload?
I've just seen the first episode. Yes.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
very provocative.
yeah, it is. And I think that it looks like they actually gave some kind of serious thought about VR and AR and embodied computing in that, and that the kind of presentation of those technologies is really kind of thoughtful and pointing to a possible future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great kind of example, because again, often people think of VR and AR as like these headsets, and these controllers. And again, the reason why we say VR and AR, virtual reality and augmented reality, are just the interfaces is really, this is like a new computing paradigm, which is going to have a whole ecosystem of new kind of experiences and tools. And that show, I think, is, for those who haven't seen it, Upload is about this idea that like you can choose to upload your kind of consciousness into this virtual world. The catch is that it's this corporate designed world where you're kind of stuck in this virtual heaven where you can kind of have everything as long as you have like the right subscriptions and, you know, people are, you know, your credit card is signed up in heaven kind of thing. But the idea there is really kind of in some ways a metaphor, and even a more powerful metaphor happening in the midst of this kind of, you know, quarantine, global quarantine, which is, you know, we've been in this process of creating, you know, these virtual exchanges, virtual work, now virtual worlds that people are going into. And really, as we, you know, transition into those, there's some things that are going to be recognizable to us, like, because we're going to try to recreate things that we're already doing. And then, but there's going to be whole new behaviors, whole new cultures, whole new rituals that are emerging in these spaces, whole new politics, even economics, as, you know, kind of Upload points out.
Have you seen any kind of early signals about what's changed as a result of the coronavirus?
Well, yes. I think, you know, one of the things that a lot of folks have been talking about at IFTF, including us, is just this idea that, you know, in some ways, you know, the role of foresight practitioners and futurists, you know, is to help people, you know, think that the world might be at all different than it is today or yesterday or last week. And turns out that's a hard thing to do because, you know, the human brain is kind of designed to like continue patterns and based on the patterns we've already experienced. And so previously, a lot of the work we've had to do as, you know, at IFTF is like, I would even say like, if I had to put a number on it, like 80 to 90% of the work we do is like just trying to shake people out of the idea that what's already happening, you know, is what's going to happen, that just to be open to that. And so a lot of what we talk about at IFTF is this idea of provocation. How do you provoke people's mind to be like, wait a minute, oh yeah, that could be different. Now that was before. Now we're in this new period where literally every day and kind of every minute of our lives is a provocation that the world is changing. And I think that kind of our role as futurists is slightly shifting in that way, in many ways into a much more interesting space, because, you know, I like to say that a lot of the work we do is, you know, people come to us, of course, you know, I bet this happens to you, Mark, like, oh, you work for the Institute for the Future. What's going to happen? Right? Like, tell me what's going to happen. And what we, you know, really like to make clear to folks is that no one can predict the future. But you can think more, you know, creatively about it, more strategically about it, more systematically about the future, more collaboratively with other people about the future. And the purpose is not to predict what's going to happen. The purpose is to create resiliency and agility when things change. And suddenly this is like something that everyone's a lot more receptive and maybe even hungry for. How do we have this resiliency? So this is a long way of saying, yes, we're tracking lots of signals right now that are emerging around how these behaviors are changing. Kind of the reason I think we decided to call this the Great Hackathon right now was that the world itself is engaged in this global scale hackathon, trying to figure out how can we kind of maintain any of both the kind of, you know, essential aspects of our lives, the kind of key social aspects of our lives, the spiritual aspects of our lives. How do we maintain all these things? And for a lot of the work that, you know, you and I do looking into signals, a lot of times these things are these tools, these connection tools, these collaboration tools, these alternative ways of doing things are kind of on the fringe. And now suddenly those are kind of our only options. So people are like, okay, how do I use Zoom to do a funeral, right? How do I still get, you know, go out to eat, you know? So like one of the kind of interesting, like often we'll look at signals, right? And we'll start to see trends growing out of the signals. One of the, I think the interesting kind of trends that I think we're starting to see is this drive-in culture that's starting to happen, right? We're seeing not only resurgence of drive-in restaurants, but we're seeing like things like drive-in music festivals, you know, and drive-in movie theaters are back on the rise. I love drive-in movie theaters. I'm not happy this is why it's happening, but I even just saw there's a drive-in strip club that opened up in, I believe, Portland. Yeah. And so the kind of drive-in culture is resurging there. Those are the kind of things that, you know, right now it's like people need their personal bubble, and the car is kind of a natural personal bubble. The kind of the other signals that, and I'll put a plug in right now. I'm super excited that we have just kind of a couple months ago just launched our own internal signals platform now called Future Factors. So now we used to have a little bit more distributed kind of process of collecting signals. Now we have this kind of collaborative tool that we use to collect these signals, so we're able to see each other's kind of signal collection process. But the other area, I guess kind of that we're specifically doing some client work on and that we're really interested in, and it kind of goes close to my heart, is looking at, and I kind of pointed to this with the idea of Zoom funerals, is how are we doing the rituals and rites of passage in our life? This is not like a 3-day hurricane emergency. This is now turning into a months-long situation where life is on hold, and we can no longer gather in the ways that we used to be able to. And there's things that are happening in people's lives. People are being born, people are dying, people are having birthdays, people are graduating, all these kind of important moments of our lives that aren't just a celebration, but they're really a part of our sense making of how we understand ourselves. How do we recognize shifting of identities? How do we recognize shifting of kind of social fabric as members are moving from one stage of a life to another? So that's, I think, a really interesting area that we're looking into. And you can see it in more kind of playful ways of people, creating online parties, but then there's more kind of serious things, like I said, like funerals and those kinds of things. So just today I saw Stonehenge is going to be live streaming their summer solstice ritual for the first time ever, because they can't gather people there. And I just think that's interesting. And it's not just interesting because you see creative ways of kind of solving these problems. What's really interesting when you look at this is it's an incredible reflection point, because we do the rituals and rites of passage in our lives, these traditions, often without thinking about them. We do them because it's what we do. And encoded in those things are a lot of really powerful maps to understanding, again, who we are to each other, who we are in the world, and how do we relate to mystery in the universe or the cosmos. And when those get broken down, those traditions, and we can't do them, then we have to evaluate, how do we translate? And when we go through that translation process, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the essence? Why do we even do this? And what is easy to take forward? What is hard? What is hard to take forward but is worth it because it's important? What are things that we should strip away? My cousins just got married online, in a cyber wedding, they called it, in Zoom, and kind of a combination of Zoom, live stream, Vimeo, and Instagram Live, and they translated their wedding. And it was interesting because a lot of the things they chose to kind of add, they felt like, oh, we're adding they're both kind of techno geek folks, so they added a lot of aspects of that aren't traditional, but they had kind of the license to make those changes where aren't normally, and they had the license to kind of remove things that weren't meaningful to them. So this is it's not just the technology, and this is kind of always coming back to what interests me. It's never just the technology. It's really, what do we do with it? How does it shape us? What does it mean to us? What are these rituals? What are these ways that we transform ourselves and each other?
Yeah, that's interesting. We had a question from Robert Best that I think is kind of appropriate to ask. When we were discussing kind of the resurgence of drive-in activities, he said, so is this a signal for the deeper entrenching of car culture? I think that's a really interesting question.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. So personally, I'm actually looking into not just a car culture, but van culture, with the recognition, like, not only is it going to be very difficult to travel, you're not going to be, if you're able to fly, it's going to be risky. If you're going to be traveling, you're not necessarily going to want to stay at a hotel or even an Airbnb or even a friend's house right now. So how do we have mobility? And so I'm looking into kind of like camper vans right now. They are, I think, in some ways an extension of more of like this kind of these bubbles that we are needing to create, and in response to a pandemic of an infectious disease. So I think car culture, yes, because people are going to be less apt to take public transportation.
Hmm.
flying. We're less likely to be even allowed to go to other countries as Americans for the next
Hmm.
foreseeable future. So this summer is going to be very interesting. I think we'll see a lot of car culture. But again, I think this is more around kind of how we kind of are creating these safety bubbles. So we're also seeing lots of signals that go even more personal around, like literally like bubbles that people wear on their head. And some of them are very space age, like, okay, here's your rave bubble outfit so you can go to a rave party. Some of them are very like high fashion for people who, want to be able to go to the mall, but still, have their kind of high fashion look. So yeah, I think this is, for those who are kind of taking the infectious disease seriously, which is probably most people, we are looking for ways to kind of create these containment spaces for
Hmm.
ourselves.
Like an extension of the controlled environment that we have at home. We're like kind of bringing that with us out into the public. We'll probably see
Yes.
more of that. And, for better or worse, driving cars around is one way to do it.
Yeah, it's true.
That's interesting. So yeah, that was a great question. Thanks a lot for that, Robert. And just a comment from Avo Heining. This sounds really interesting. Um, Avo says, we're working on a drive-through Pride experience that also includes all art vehicles like bikes, but from a distance. So it's all in how you design for experiences. I just built a trike for experiences. That's really cool.
That's great.
Yeah. Um, so one thing that you talked about the Stonehenge's annual ritual. A lot of events are going virtual. They just have to. You have been doing a lot of researching into the different kinds of platforms and tools and practices that are arising out of this new necessity. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, kind of the bigger category I think is kind of virtual gatherings. These kind
Hmm.
of how do we
Hmm.
how do we gather? It's such a huge part where humans are social beings, right? And obviously, we've already, I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment to go back and think about, the Spanish flu of 1918 and how people were experiencing that without kind of an internet where information was extremely limited. And we've kind of got in many ways the opposite problem where we've got an onslaught of information right now. But obviously, it's a very different time that we have the internet right now. And incidentally, I think it's an interesting flip at this moment where there's been a lot of techlash around things like Facebook and too much screen time. And suddenly
Hmm.
now that's in some ways those things are our lifelines. And I think people's kind of attitudes towards those have slightly changed for better or for worse. But yeah, so we're like almost every organization, particularly ones that have a lot of human interaction, like in real life experiences. We're trying to think through how do we translate? How do we do our foresight trainings? How do we do our expert workshops? How do we do our large research summit, our 10-year forecast, as virtual experiences? And we've been looking at we're doing kind of we're taking some of our traditional methodologies of like technology horizon scan. So like, let's just look at every single kind of technologies that's available for these kinds of things. And then let's start to categorize them. So there's everything from um, full virtual conference platforms that offer everything from registration to the actual main stage events to like the social little one-on-one speed dating experiences. And then there's things like, of course, like Zoom that are more highly focused on a certain area. And then there are tools like for things like visual collaboration, like virtual whiteboarding and virtual stickies. And then, so those are kind of, and actually one of the frameworks that I'm using to kind of figure out how not only how we can do this, but how we can share our process and our learnings with our community and our clients around how to translate into virtual events is using some of the frameworks that the educational technology world has been developing. There's this framework called SAMR, which stands for substitution, augmentation, modification, and redesign. And it's really it's really trying to pull apart that some technologies just do minor changes where you're just substituting, like, okay, instead of, let's say, in education, instead of writing my homework on a piece of paper, I'm going to type it on a word processor and then I'm going to hand it in. So that's kind of substitution. Augmentation is when you kind of do the same thing, but you slightly change it. So maybe instead of me printing out that paper, I email it to my teacher. So now I'm augmenting. Then there's modification, where you're actually starting to introduce new tasks that weren't possible with the previous medium. So that would be something like, I'm doing it in Google Docs, and now, a team of us are collaborating on this in real time. You couldn't do that. Well, I guess you could do that on a real piece of paper, but you couldn't do it remotely. And then like redesign is where you completely change what you're doing and kind of reimagine and for these new capacities. And it often takes, part of why I think that's useful is that there's so many possibilities out there of things we could do, and especially as a futurist organization, we're looking at kind of the fringe opportunities. But we're a human organization with our own kind of adoption curves, like any organization. So we need to kind of start slow. So how can you, begin with starting with what are the simple things to substitute? So maybe we find a platform that allows us just to do like virtual stickies, just in the same way we use lots of stickies for our ideation sessions. So those are the kind of things that, like, we're trying to not just look at tools, but try to look at what are kind of design principles, both from an experience design as well as from kind of like a pedagogical like approach. How do we teach in new ways? So I think we're in this like pivot moment where, like every organization, is trying to kind of, okay, how do we quickly substitute? How do we quickly just swap out things? But I think we're going to get to, in the next couple of months, and hopefully by our own summit later this year, we're going to be inventing some very new kinds of experience. And so I'm spending a lot of time too in just kind of like fringe case experiences to see like what kind of experimentations are people doing. There's a group here based in the Bay Area called Immersive Verse that's been throwing these kind of weekend parties, but they're kind of immersive art experiences where you basically go to kind of a hub website that you have an invitation to, and then from there you get to go into sometimes 24 different artist designed experiences. Most of them are in Zoom, but they're kind of immersive interactive theater, and they're very wide ranging. Probably the most interesting one that I've been to through that party is something called Online Town. I don't know if you've heard about it yet, Mark,
No.
but it's a very primitive, very early. If you go to sempre.com and search Online Town, it's this
Could
platform created SEIMPRE, I believe. I'm a terrible speller, but it's the same phrase that I think the military uses.
Okay.
It's Latin, right? But I'll put it in the chat in a minute.
Okay, cool.
But what it is you go to a website and you see a little kind of window into a gaming map. It looks like a little Nintendo, from the 1990s gaming map. It's a top-down gaming map. And it's like, it can be a city, it can be a park, and you have a little avatar that's you, and using the arrow keys, you move up and down. And then if you invite someone else into your town, you can have them have an avatar. And the cool mechanic is that when your avatars get closer together, you get a video chat window that pops up, and you see and hear the real person. And what is really powerful about this, that is, I think, if you go there, you'll see it's a very primitive kind of proof of concept, but what it represents is a very interesting vector. Right now, this kind of the Zoom kind of paradigm that we're mostly in is this idea of like, we're all locked in a single room. Everybody is either talking to everybody or not talking to anybody. And it's very difficult to have kind of natural conversation. If anybody's done a virtual happy hour, you know what I'm talking about. It's like, okay, 40 people all like talking at once, and it's kind of awkward, right?
Yeah.
So in Online Town, it allows you to like move and to a different space, and like 2 or 3 people can go over there, and you can have a conversation Or you can have, you can set up like a map and say, hey, everybody, let's go meet me in the kitchen, and, and have 3 or 4 people, segment off. So this idea of kind of natural emergent segmentation of social conversations, or if you were to do like a workshop in one of these spaces, like, often at IFTF, we'll have like a group of, 40 people, or, and we break them off into groups of, 10. They're working separately, but you can hear the chatter, and you could even walk by that other table, and you might, get inspired either with a specific idea or just hear the excitement of that team. And you're like, oh, that team is doing a lot. I need to go back to my team and rally them. And that's one example of many that is missing when we use something like Zoom, where it works great. It's like, it's kind of then the easy meeting place, but lots of interesting innovations like that are kind of bubbling up to try to solve for these subtle things that we took for granted when we have in real life experiences, that are just not necessarily there when we actually, the only option we have is, this tool or that tool.
Yeah. So right now, almost everyone is using just their displays, smartphones, tablets, laptops to interact with people virtually. VR is still pretty much out of reach for a lot of people, even though the prices are going down. But let's talk a little bit about the role of VR, and if you're seeing a resurgence in interest in VR and where we might be headed in that area.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's an interesting moment for VR. VR has been in kind of yet another VR winter. People have talked about many VR winters. We've been in a bit of one after kind of the initial surge of 2016, 2017, where, everyone was being told it's going to transform the world. And people were ready, okay, let's transform the world overnight. And, maybe that could have happened, but it hasn't. And we could get into a longer conversation of why that didn't happen initially. But what we are seeing right now is a resurgence in interest, partially because of the idea of social VR. Social VR is where you're not just in virtual reality. You go into VR, you put on a headset, and then you're in a virtual world where you have an avatar, an embodied avatar, and then other people are also in that virtual world with you, and you can have social experience, and that can be used for work. So there's platforms like Spatial or The Wild, or Arc Virtual, that allow you to go in there and have a conference meeting and show PowerPoints in a virtual office. As you can imagine, there's a lot of companies that are interested in creating virtual workspaces right now. So we're seeing a lot of kind of rapid investment and development in those areas, and we're tracking that very closely. Education is another area that social VR there's a lot of interest in. There's platforms like Engage VR, or even AltSpace, which is one of the longest running, now owned by Microsoft, is doing educational sessions in there. These are, I will, tell you, it's still very early, but we're seeing lots of interest. And, part of the problem with the whole virtual reality and augmented reality industry for several years is that the people creating the experiences and the platforms were game designers and technologists. And so you mostly saw video games that were immersive and technology demos. What we needed is more community involvement and a much more diverse group of content creators and users, and we're starting to get that now. And I think this is going to be not just a resurgence because of the investment in the technology and the just financial investment, but it's really because of the participating communities that are going in there and saying, I'm a teacher, I don't want to teach on Zoom. And there's some things like, one of the things we're always looking for in these communication platforms is something that our fellow colleague Bob Johansson calls better than being there. So we're always looking sometimes there's a lot of things that are worse than being there, but sometimes there's things better than being there experiences.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting better than being there possible things around VR education is not just that you could put someone in a virtual world and take them anywhere and just take them to the edge of the universe or down to a molecule, but literally when a child is wearing a headset, they're focused, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're able to kind of have that controlled environment. Obviously that can be misused, but it also could be used in really powerful ways if used correctly. And then the last category for kind of social VR that we're looking at is kind of play, like arts and entertainment. And there's some really interesting things happening there. One of my favorite social VR platforms is called Wave XR, and they are a virtual immersive music platform for performance. So they for several years they've been hosting DJ performances there, where you can go in and go to a DJ concert. They also had live musician performances, and they just are about, they've gotten a lot of excitement from the, basically music industry, who's completely put on hold with all their in real life concerts, and maybe for quite a long time. So there was a little bit of interest. Now there's a tremendous amount of interest. So they just announced they're going to be doing concerts with people like John Legend in virtual reality. And then, yeah, some of the other kind of play experiences there, you can go in there and do sports. I'm now doing a daily workout in something called Supernatural, which is actually getting me back in shape at home, where
Cool.
I'm able to go to like different beautiful environments all around the world and work out, essentially.
Oh, wow. I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, it's called Supernatural. It runs on the Oculus Quest, which is actually the last thing I wanted to mention on this topic, which is there's a kind of somewhat tragic irony right now, which is at the moment in which pretty much the whole world wouldn't mind having kind of a low cost, easy to use, high quality VR headset. The one that is the Oculus Quest is almost impossible to buy right now, partially because for kind of mysterious reasons, Oculus, aka Facebook, just stopped kind of manufacturing enough. So there was already a global shortage before the pandemic. And then with most of these kind of devices are manufactured in China, so the supply chain has been cut down. You can still get them. You might pay a premium. They're normally like $400 to $500. Now, people resell them for like $600 to $700, or occasionally they pop up on Walmart for a day and they're up there for an hour. So if you're interested if someone's interested in VR and social VR experiences, the Quest is very interesting, but if you have to kind of put some effort into getting one. And one of the interesting things about the Quest too is that with the right cable, you can do something called Quest Link, where normally the Quest is just a standalone unit. This is the whole headset. There's no computer attached. It's just you pop it on and you have the hand controllers. But you can, if you want, you can plug it into a powerful gaming computer and do very powerful experiences, which actually I did want to mention too. The other kind of big thing in VR news right now is that Valve, the kind of famous gaming company, recently launched the long-awaited version of Half-Life, which is in VR, which they've been working on for 9 years. I mean, I think the last installment of Half-Life was 13 years ago. And this is a company that's known for redefining categories, and they've done it with VR Half-Life. It's called Half-Life Alyx. And I've only done the first 30 minutes, but if you've tried much VR, one of the things you'll notice, especially if you're a gamer or a cinema person, you're like, okay, a lot of this doesn't look very well designed. It looks more kind of developer driven than designer driven. If you go into Half-Life Alyx, it's like stepping into a cinematic experience where everything is interactive, and you can pick up like the random beer can and look at it, and everything has physics, and it's kind of the first AAA VR experience available that's launched at the moment, where almost nobody can get headsets, where everybody would want one. So
that's amazing.
I will warn you, it's kind of scary though. It's it's a very scary game.
Yeah, it's scary just on this plain old flat panel display.
Right. Well, imagine these things. I had to stop the other night when like these creatures kept stabbing me in the chest over and over again. I couldn't figure out how to stop it. I was like, I think this is not the good thing to do before I go to bed.
Yeah, totally. Well, moving in the opposite direction, what I think is interesting is the way that people are using another hard to get item, the Nintendo Switch, to actually kind of use Animal Crossing as a way to socialize with each other, and using it kind of in unexpected ways, like AOC, going around and like visiting people's islands and leaving gifts and stuff. This is kind of like, it just shows you the desire people have to socialize. They'll use anything, even a game that wasn't really meant to be this pandemic replacement for hanging out, but that's what they're using it for.
Absolutely. Do you have a Switch, Mark?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I have Animal Crossing, my daughter does. So we visit each other's islands and stuff like that. It's
I
fun.
need to get one because I put all my effort to just try to get Oculus Quests, but now my next
Yeah.
target is to get a Switch. But
Well, good
yeah,
luck.
I know, seriously, pay like $1,000 for one. Lots of interesting signals coming out of Animal Crossing. I just saw one the other day that people are actually like farming bells. I'm not that familiar with the game, but I guess they're valuable and
Yeah.
making money. So this is a
Right.
kind of a new industry for folks who are out of work and going in there and raising virtual crops, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of like the coin of the realm is the bells. So I think that, yeah, there is like I don't know if you meet somewhere else, like, another forum, and you agree to do a transfer for real money, someone will gift you bells or something like that. It's probably
Yeah, this
something of
one
the,
woman, she said she's paying her rent in Brooklyn off of raising bells, which was
wow.
crazy. And then we saw, I think, China retailers were shutting down sales of Animal Crossing, which I believe is the most popular Switch game, because
Hmm.
people were doing pro Hong Kong protests inside of Animal Crossing.
Wow. It's amazing.
But I
It's
think
amazing.
this is kind of I'm glad you brought that up because often when people think of VR, it's like they think of it as just virtual reality. I like the term XR, which is more around like cross reality. So we're creating these virtual spaces. We already have a lot of virtual spaces. Google Docs is kind of a virtual, very kind of limited dimensional virtual world, but we're creating these virtual worlds, and really it's about how do we create kind of multiple access and different portals into these virtual worlds. So I think things like Animal Crossing, those are kind of growing up from one kind of evolutionary strain. Or if you look at something like Fortnite, that's having these like massive millions of people going into these concerts for, I think it was Travis Scott was recent and Marshmello was last year. All of these are, again, building up these kind of virtual worlds. And eventually you'll be able to pop in through a headset or a handset or a laptop. But they're all kind of, building up those similar things. And I think, you pointed out or just bringing up the theme of protest. That's another kind of interesting area of signal that we've been looking at, is in this time where people literally can't go into the streets and massive political changes are happening. What are the new ways that people are able to politic, essentially? Like, how do you know, uh, how do you protest? How do you demonstrate? How do you gather people for political purposes? So I hadn't heard
Hmm.
about the AOC signal. That's pretty interesting. I wonder
Yeah.
how many politicians are going to go in there.
Yeah. I wonder myself. It's a great use of it. Um, Toshi, we've got a few questions. I'd like to devote some time to
Yeah.
answering questions. And just a reminder to the participants today, if you have a question, go ahead and just click that little Q&A button at the bottom of your window and leave your question there. There's Instead of leaving them in the comments, because it's kind of hard to like pick out what the questions are that you want answered in the comments. So go ahead and just pop them into the Q&A and I'll try to get to them. So yeah, we've got quite a few questions here, so I'll just go through them in order. Here's one from Charles L. Perkins. Do you know of any groups studying the brain-body difference in effects and quality of intimacy between physical and virtual group collaborations?
Sorry, can you read that one more
Yes,
time?
so
That's a
sure.
great.
So he's basically saying, do you know of any research into looking at the way uh, people's brains and bodies uh, react to intimacy differently between physical and virtual group collaborations? Like,
Hmm.
how do people respond differently online versus in person? Is there, differences? I'm guessing like in eye contact or where attention is paid, things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different disparate research projects going on in that area. One person I would point you to is a researcher up in Portland, Jessica Outlaw, who's done a lot of research around kind of emerging social behaviors in social VR experiences. She's got some interesting white papers up on that. I think all of the social VR platforms are kind of doing their own live experimentation and development in that space. I think one of the most interesting books to kind of read is Philosophy in the Flesh by George Lakoff, who's the linguist and kind of political scientist over at UC Berkeley. I guess he's retired now. That's a little bit less about how we interact socially and more around how kind of everything is an embodied metaphor. It's one of the great books on kind of embodied cognition and how we even understand in those spaces. For kind of more specific research studies, I'd have to kind of pull from my notes though.
Okay, that's fine. And when you come up with some of those, we'll add links at iftf.com/
yeah, we can do that later.
Yeah,
and by the way, I did put the
series.
online, I think it's called the online town. Let's see, it's called The Online at .town if you're interested in checking it out.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Toshi. Yeah. Here's a question from our old friend Jeremy Kirschbaum. Jeremy asks, any practical tips any practical tips for making my remote team's workflow better? Any best practices for getting that feeling of team cohesion that seems harder for remote workflows? It's another great question.
Yeah, so this is a question we're asking. So it's, one of the most important things, like I talked a lot about the technology, and though that's essential, like you need the technology, but really more importantly, it's the facilitation, right? And it's not what the technology can do, it's what you do with the technology. So we're looking into a lot of aspects and lots of really interesting new practices. And internally at IFTF, we've got a lot of master facilitators. So it's just really interesting to see the things that people are experimenting with. One of the things that people are trying to do is try to understand, like, how do we deal with the fact that, with these kind of Zoom remote collaboration experiences, we are kind of living in this flat world, right? And we're not only living in a flat world, we're kind of distracted. And, right now, this window is a very small window in my actual world out here in space now, in my real office. And how do you kind of weave people's real life into this experience, because that is part of my experience right now, what's going on in my room. So some interesting examples of the kind of things that are kind of experiments that I think are kind of represent some interesting vectors are like, one group was saying like, well, after, let's say you're doing an all day long workshop, after lunch, we want everyone to come back with a virtual background that represents a future they want to live in, and bring one physical item from your office that shows like why you're interested in the future. And just weaving of these narratives that acknowledge like who you are, because that's one of the big things that's kind of, well, one of many things that's lost when you're not in an IRL experience, which is that, there's a lot of subtle human bonding that happens just through body gesture. So you have to be a lot more intentional with your social weaving. Another thing that people are doing is like a lot of these, like, let's not just talk about the transaction of this meeting. Let's make sure to kind of have that like water cooler talk, but maybe be a little bit more intentional around it. Like we had a staff meeting where before you kind of presented your work, you had to say the first concert you went to. And again, just recognizing the humanity and the story that people have. The other design principle that's kind of rising to the surface through a lot of the expert interviews that we're doing with event producers who are transitioning is really to leverage this concept of like a story, right? And a narrative. When you're trying to do experience design, you really want to use the framework of storytelling, which, there's a lot of known kind of aspects that work really well for people. And one kind of very simple pattern that I think is really useful, and that can be applied to, a 3-day workshop or a short webinar or just any kind of engagement, especially one that's interactive that you're trying to involve people, is think about right now kind of this 3-part structure of like traditional myths. There's kind of, you have people start in their familiar world. Then the second part is you take them to a special place where they receive some special knowledge or tool. And then the third part is that the hero character, this is the hero's journey, returns to their natural world and integrates those tools or knowledge back in. And you can map this very simply to virtual events where you have what happens before the event. How do you create maybe a ritual that's a little bit more intentional of the crossing of the threshold, it's called, from the normal world to the special world. At IFTF, that is literally stepping through the doorway at IFTF. We know that, I mean, I know even when I step in there, even though I've been there for 4 years, like there's something different when I step inside that building that just isn't inherent of that space, that isn't necessarily going to be there unless you intentionally create that threshold moment. Then what is this kind of special space? How do you call out these things like the tools? How do you present kind of these mythical characters like the mentor and kind of the challenges? And then how do you also support people on their reintegration into their real lives? So what happens after the online engagement? What is the follow-up? And that's where some of the kind of there's benefits to online collaboration, where you can really you can extend these kind of stages out and have more engagement over the course of those different stages. So that was kind of broad, Jeremy, but hopefully that was useful.
No, that was great. So it's like the monomyth applied to online events and collaboration. That's cool.
Yeah, that's basically the idea.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we have time for a couple more questions. Here's one from an anonymous attendee. Do we need, and will there ever be, an adequate substitute for face-to-face, skin-to-skin, in-person contact with each other, or with physical environments, for example, Stonehenge, in virtual reality platforms? What do we lose or gain by interacting through virtual bubbles? I mean, you've kind of answered that a little bit, but yeah. So do you think there will be a way to substitute real physical contact, or are we always going to require physical contact?
I mean, the short answer is no, right? We're never going to replace what it means to be breathing the same air as somebody, and the physical sensation of being hugged, or just the ability just to reach out and touch somebody at any moment. So it's not a story of replacement, right? I mean, we've talked a lot at IFTF around the idea of, like, less around, and the same question goes for artificial intelligence. Can you create a real human? No, you're never going to create exactly the same thing. And in fact, it's also like it's more around extending and kind of augmenting what we're already doing. Now, of course, we're in this kind of moment where we're very limited in how we can physically interact, and there's a lot of questions about, even in the longer term future, how much we're going to be able to freely interact. That said, I think it's the areas where it's going to get richer and more valuable aren't in the replacement, right? We do want some substitution, just going back to this SAMR framework.
Mm-hmm.
So some things we are going to want to substitute, like that we want to be able to talk and see each other. So Zoom kind of does that, obviously with some limitations. But where it's going to get transformational is when we're doing things that we didn't used to do. And that's to say, number one, you can't replace the physical experience, but number two, I don't know if you really want to, right? I mean, none of us actually, I know of a couple of people that would disagree with this, but most of us don't want to be living in a technology-based existence all the time. We're kind of forced into that right now. But that said, we, especially for the short term, like, we need to start making these experiences more rich. So adding things like haptic experience, and adding things like, richer, easier to navigate virtual worlds are going to be important. Finding ways to build trust inside of virtual reality. So there's people who are trying to, like, integrate, eye tracking cameras. And there's some really interesting research out of Facebook Reality Labs around, like, the difference between having like an avatar that just has kind of glassy eyes, and one that is actually reflecting where your eyes are looking. Because there's a lot of trust that's negotiated between eye contact. Now, of course, is that going to be the same? No. So, but we have to experiment in these spaces. I mean, there's actually it was an interesting signal someone found in the iOS pre-build, like a beta version of the iOS a couple months ago, that they had set it up. So, when you do FaceTime, when you're looking at somebody, one of the things that's distracting is that they're looking down. Like, or even now, I'm looking down and not looking at the camera. Well, they were using augmented reality to find people's eyes and replace their eyeballs as if you were looking at the camera. So
that's cool. So it just tilts the angle up a little bit.
Exactly. But this is all to say we're not going to replace real life. You're never going to do that. But
Hmm.
are we going to potentially create something richer and more, I wouldn't say better, but we're an adapting species, I mean,
Hmm.
is going to the supermarket, the same as raising your own food? No, of course not, right? But is it better in some ways? Maybe. Yeah, it's definitely different, and we're an evolving kind of system and species.
Yeah. Well, we have more questions, but I think we need to wrap it up. Toshi, this has been really fantastic speaking with you. And I've learned a lot. I always learn a ton whenever I talk to you. Thanks so
Me
much.
too. I always enjoy talking with you, Mark.
And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thanks for all your comments and your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but you can always find out more information about this series as well as archived episodes of our online collaboration at iftf.org/online collaboration series. We will have a recorded version of this conversation up there so you can rewatch it if you want. We'll try to quickly put up as many of the links to the things we talked about. And so please visit that URL when you get a chance. And we're also proud to announce that IFTF is now offering our renowned strategic foresight training, IFTF Foresight Essentials, online. And you can see how we have been taking a lot of what we've been talking about today into practice. Our first session in May is already sold out, but there are still a few seats available for later in June. So if you're interested in that, you can go to iftf.org/foresight essentials and you can find out more. So I'm going to sign off now. I just want to tell everybody to stay safe and we will see you soon.
Hey,
Thanks,
Mark.
everybody.
Wait,
Yeah,
Mark, can I put
yeah,
in one plug?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we are in the early kind of planning stages for creating what we're calling a social VR learning journey over the next couple of months, where we'd be basically creating a series of webinars around social VR in these areas of work, education, and play. And we're hoping to gather folks who have XR, VR headsets to join us in these virtual worlds. So we haven't officially launched that yet, but I just wanted to kind of put that on people's radar. If you sign up for our newsletter, that would be a place where you'd hear more about this. But I hope maybe some of you will join us in there, because I'm just looking at the chat and I can see some XR natives in here.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. And we will see you soon for another one of these conversations. I really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.